Dr. Rebecca Williams, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's really good to have you here. And we're going to be discussing your new book, The Gift of Recovery, 52 Mindful Ways to Live Joyfully Beyond Addiction. That's a very strong title. But before we get into that, let me ask you how you first became interested in addiction.
Yeah, I first became interested in addiction in graduate school. Actually, I had a great professor mentor who had a huge research project focusing on couples who were recovering from addiction. And I was one of the therapists and one of the researchers on that grant back in 1995 or 6. And it was a wonderful way to get started to look at how couples were handling recovering from addiction and all the stress and strife that goes on there. So that was how I originally got started. Along with a lot of your listeners, I have family members who have been recovering from addiction also.
Okay, not yourself though. That's not your background.
Not myself though. No.
Okay. Yeah, and often that's how we get our dissertations done in graduate school is helping a professor with their research. And when it's especially magical, people tend to continue along that line of investigation. So,
exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
The dissertation did get done, finished, which is the whole point of doing a dissertation is to finish it.
Yeah. Yeah. So my guess is that there are a lot of books out there about addiction from one angle or another. So you must have had something special in mind. How would you describe the unique slant of your book?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a ton of books on addiction, and there are also a ton of people trying to recover from addiction. I think the number is 3 to 25 million people. So it's definitely necessary to be able to put information out there that makes sense. The reason I got focused on my own ideas is because I was noticing what was missing in the literature, specifically loss. So one of the things that I kept looking in the back of the book to figure out what's going on with loss and addiction. Why aren't they talking about that loss can actually propel someone into addiction? And once someone is addicted, they can also have additional losses piled one on top of the other. So our first book, Julie Kraft and I have written 2 books together. The first book we wrote was the Mindfulness Workbook for Addiction. That book tackles loss, trying to understand a person in recovery, how they handle loss, what's going on, rather than running from loss, to try to understand and make sense of a person's loss in their life. So it could be a loss of another person in terms of death or bereavement. In that regard, it could be loss of freedom, like folks getting out of prison. It could be a loss of childhood. So we were trying to kind of understand, incorporate the idea of how do you handle loss. And that was how the first book got started with Julie Kraft and myself. And the second book, The Gift of Recovery, we took it a step further to try to weave in joy, like you said earlier.
Right.
Joy and a positive direction once someone is recovering and has dealt with the loss and all the emotions that go along with that.
Well, it's interesting that you've attached loss to addiction because, you know, we're used to hearing it in association with depression as triggering depression. And I've never made that connection for myself before about loss and addiction, but I could see that, in fact, there would be a connection there, and you know that might be a way of sort of acting out the depression, if you will, or trying to numb oneself from the depression, self-medicate.
Exactly, that's exactly our thinking.
Interesting. That's a creative angle, I think. And what about meditation? Because I would have thought your answer was going to be, oh, our unique slant is meditation, mindfulness. How did you become interested in those?
Yeah, it's all connected, right? Yeah. I originally became interested in mindfulness when I started doing yoga when it was uncool in 1984. Before it got all awesome like it is today. But I was doing yoga and also teaching yoga in New York City a while ago. And I really used yoga and just starting mindfulness and meditation to kind of get me to the next level of everything. So in other words, I was in New York as an exercise trainer and a yoga instructor, and I wanted to go to graduate school. So I actually try to keep myself calm in Manhattan and move to the next level. So it helped me, and I've been doing yoga for 34 years to maintain my sense of wellness. My meditation, not as easy for me. I don't know how it was for you, Dr. Dave, but it is.
I'm still working on the discipline, to tell you the truth.
Exactly, me too. So when I first started meditating, I was really cool, and I brought a little meditation cushion and put it in a room and thought, I got it. And I brought my coffee, my newspaper, my cereal up into my meditation room with my little, cushion. And I just was all over the map. I didn't know what I was doing. I was very distracted. It was very unfun. And eventually, I just kept going back, which is what we recommend to clients, just to keep going back to meditating for 5 minutes a day, just sitting quietly. Eventually, for me, I actually got rid of the newspaper, and then I got cereal, and then I got rid of, eventually, the coffee. That was the last to go. But I just had that room with a cushion, myself, no distractions, and that's where I got to. It took me quite a few years to get there. So it's, as we recommend, just to kind of, wherever you are is where you are, and start there with meditation. And
I love that. And I love that story, the coffee and the newspaper. I was going to say, that doesn't sound very meditative.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it was something that you wrestled with. I really appreciate your sharing it. And as we kind of move through discussing your book and so on, feel free to throw in any stories, case examples
Sure.
along the way. That always livens things up. So I'm wondering, anytime we talk about well, let me ask you, I'm looking at some of the questions I had planned here, noticing that I've already skipped over a bunch somehow. So say a little bit about your understanding of substance addiction, and why some people get addicted and others don't, and why it's so different to kick. I assume you've got some kind of a model that you're working from.
Yeah, there's a lot of models, Dave. It's still in development. However, as most people know, and probably a lot of your listeners know, there's a genetic component to addiction. Let's call that, say, 30%. And then there's a component to addiction. Maybe that's another 30%. How you grew up, who you were around, was there addiction in the family, the environment that you grew up in, was there trauma and stress and significant milestones that were either met or not met growing up. So I think that 30%, I'm just kind of estimating 30% genes, 30% environment. And then there's this other little piece that I think we're all trying to figure out, and that is, are there other things going on in the brain that are propelling someone more toward addiction? And frankly, using drugs and alcohol, it's pretty intense for the brain. Once you start loading up alcohol, drugs, and other destructive behaviors on the brain likes that, it wants more. So that's kind of the other 35% or so, where folks are actually using drugs and their brains are actually changing as they're using drugs and alcohol. So the serotonin gets activated, the dopamine gets activated, and then when you stop, your body wants more, your brain wants more. It's fairly intense, as you know, and as your clients know. So there's a lot of components to it. And I think the key is to understand we probably can't really change the genes that you have. We probably can't change your early childhood environment anymore, but we can change how your brain functions. And that's kind of what our books are talking about, the fact that you can actually slowly, the brain wants to heal. That's my theory. The brain is always trying to heal, trying to get well. The body is always trying to heal, trying to get well. I create an environment for myself to stay well, and I help my clients do the same thing for their brain and for their body. So it's an ongoing process of changing the brain little by little with meditation and with changing your thoughts and changing your feelings.
Yeah, I see some of that self-healing environment behind you with the kind of mandala behind you and the orchid. So it definitely
Exactly. I
feels
have a
an
user
environment.
in my office right now with peppermint oils going off. I have a beautiful glass of fresh water. I have a garden. You know, I do a lot to heal on a day-to-day basis. I did a
Oh,
meditation walk this morning, yoga. It's to me to really to treat your mind as an entity that wants desperately to heal, and what do you need to do to get it there?
well, good for you. You're in the right place on this show.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we are interested in all of those things. And, you know, we talked earlier about mindfulness and meditation. Of course, there's been a whole wave of research on that of late. And I'm wondering, is there research that you're aware of specifically on mindfulness for substance abuse as an approach
Yeah,
to dealing with that?
absolutely. You're right. We're in the infancy stage of research for mindfulness. It's really just probably about 10 years. The research on mindfulness for depression, like you mentioned, and the research on mindfulness for, say, chronic pain has been around 20 years. But more recently, I think at a University of Utah, there's a beautiful meta-analysis study looking at a ton of different other researchers who have been working. And Dr. Garland and his team have actually put together a package of what's actually working, and they looked at 64 studies. And they're seeing that addiction and mindfulness go hand in hand, can work together. They also recommend that using other additional components, including cognitive behavioral therapy, along with mindfulness and in a recovering environment, works really well. But research is starting to show slowly that mindfulness works very well to calm the central nervous system down, to slow everything down, pause, press the pause button so that you can make good quality decisions and kind of retool how you're thinking about your whole next part of your life. So it's used, mindfulness is used in recovery centers, it's used in prisons. Our book, what the mindfulness workbook for addiction is, I've been getting emails that is being used in prisons across the country, which is extremely cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so slowly but happily, mindfulness is being used. And what I've noticed too, is I was doing a little reconnaissance myself, is to figure out what that some of the hospitals are linking up with mindfulness centers across the country.
Hmm.
Here in San Diego, we're hooked in with the Center for Mindfulness here, and I'm sure across the country, even in Utah, where I saw this article, they have an attachment to a mindfulness center. So I think we're slowly getting there.
Yeah, fascinating. And you talk about substance addiction. I'm wondering, has your work tended to specialize in a particular substance, such as alcohol, or is it more across the board?
Well, the brain works the same across the board. So in terms of addiction, so I do like to work with folks recovering from any kinds of substance addiction. But now we're seeing, as you are too, I'm sure, and your audience, there's addiction to social media, there's addiction to your cell phone, there's a lot of behavioral addictions that are very intense that are coming up the pike, and we don't even know how to handle those yet.
Yeah, really. And so let's begin to get into your book some more. One of the topics that you discuss in some depth is dealing with emotions. So what are the issues that tend to come up in relation to emotions?
Well, I think for people in recovery from addiction, the main problem that comes up is fear of emotions. They think that they should always have happy emotions like joyness, and they don't. So really what folks in recovery are noticing is that they have loneliness, anger, frustration, sadness, and those are the emotions that people go out and use again on, not the happy emotions for the most part. So in our book, we try to kind of normalize that you're going to have all sorts of emotions, and we want to prepare you to be able to cope with whatever emotions come along and kind of realize, I think our main point is that emotions are temporary. If folks can get that one thing, I think that will help them through the entire day. That what I'm feeling now, loneliness, is temporary, and it's not going to be there forever. So that's important to let people know.
And that fits in with the whole mindfulness practice as well, doesn't it? Because part of the teaching is that emotions come and go, you know, like the waves on the surface of the ocean,
Right.
or watching the clouds go by.
Right.
What about particularly strong emotions? Are some emotions more difficult to take that stance, that sensible stance with than others?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure working in hospitals and more intense inpatient settings, people are going to come across that even more so. What I believe, and I think the research backs this up, is that the idea is to bring the emotion, even the strong, strong emotion, into the room with you and just invite it in. It's usually trying to tell us something, like in other words, strong anger, strong, which is one of my favorite emotions, strong distress, strong depression. It's really there to help us. It's just that we try to, like you said, dampen it down, and we haven't had a chance to figure out what it's trying to tell us. So, for example, sometimes that means that a boundary is being crossed. And so we need to know that that could be part of the reason why someone has intense anger. Perhaps their boundaries are being crossed. That's one example.
Yeah, so there's not just kind of a discarding of the emotions or trying to tamp it down, but actually some analysis, if you will, of
Yes.
yeah, why is this in my life? What's the payoff for me?
Exactly.
What past issues does it call up?
Yeah, and the idea to be on your own side, I got that from Rick Hanson's new book called Resilience. And
Yeah.
he says it so nicely. He says, hey, be on your own side on this one. And that's kind of what we want to think about when we're thinking of mindfulness and recovery, that you really kind of want to scoot over to your own side and not be against yourself when emotions.
Yeah, so not to be all caught up in self-blame.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Punishment.
great. And I guess a closely related concept is thoughts. You know, with all psychology has struggled over the years with the relationship between thoughts and emotions. They're both there. So what are the kinds of thoughts that people recovering from addiction struggle with?
Awesome question. I do believe that most people recovering from addiction are struggling with that inner critic or that inner bully. They have like a little voice inside their head that is extremely punishing, berating, just knocking yourself down. And I do think that when you start recovering, you're going to notice that inner bully. And the key is to actually provide the antidote to that, which we believe, and we talk about in the book, is self-compassion. So no matter what the thought is, it's usually super negative. We believe that the underlying way to manage that thought is to provide kindness to yourself, compassion to yourself, realize that you're not alone, that things are going to get better. It has to happen because the brain has got so much negativity and is really tough on as it recovers. The key is to really figure out how to slowly weave in kindness and let the brain heal from the negative thoughts that are so intense.
Yeah. You know, I'm just remembering that forgot to show the book for people who might be watching this interview on YouTube. And so this is what the book looks like. It's not terribly thick. I think it's about 300 pages in paperback here. Yeah, well, no, more like 200. At the end, it's 237, including all the notes and all. And for me, the title was just a little bit misleading for my mind, because it says 52 Mindful Ways to Live Joyfully Beyond Addiction, the subtitle. And so that brought to mind sort of like little books that they used to have at the checkout stand at the supermarket, you know, and I expected a book of 52 kind of bullet points. But in fact, this is a substantial book that goes into a lot of detail, and it's not just, you know, 52 little sayings or something like that. So I want people to understand that. And one of the things that helps make it so packed full is affirmations. So let's talk a little bit. You've got affirmations in every chapter for every facet that you're covering here. And
Yeah.
so say a little bit about the rationale for the affirmations, and maybe as we go along, I'll ask you to give us an example of an affirmation.
Absolutely. The great thing about this book is that there are 52 mindful ways, which is one a week for 52 weeks. There are also,
Ah, I didn't even make that connection.
yes, there's also 365 affirmations. So you did, that's awesome. Every week there's 7 affirmations, and you can also download it. The publisher has actually provided some audio to the book, and also some downloadable, the affirmations are downloadable. So it's really to give you a set. Affirmations are just a way to reprogram your brain from negativity and the harsh critic to an idea of like, hey, I can get through this day. I can get through this moment. And for the therapists out there, it's really about self-efficacy. Can I get through? Yeah, actually I can. I can cope. That's that idea that you can make it. You can do it. So that's what's cool about affirmations. It's just another way to cope with the struggle of a day or a moment. We like to have people read them out loud. So read them out loud in the morning, put them on your phone, give yourself a reminder to look at the affirmation throughout the day, and actually read it at the end of the day. So you have a sense of just a nice, easy way to return to yourself, to value your recovery, and to stick with it.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. You know what? I'm just getting an inspiration here that you maybe ought to publish affirmation cards, because
Nice.
I'm remembering way back when I was doing an affirmation about remembering to be something or other happy or something like that, and I would put the little card. I had some affirmation cards and put it on the mirror so that I
Yes.
would see it in the morning and it would remind me. So I could see that as a nice little spin-off for your
Right.
book. Maybe the publisher could get interested in that.
Fantastic idea. Thank you.
And yeah, and so what's the URL for somebody who might want to go and find that online that you were talking about?
Well, in the book, it gives you directions. Once you buy the book, it gives you directions on how to download the audio and the affirmations. So it's attached to the back of the book. And you can, obviously, newharbinger.com, the publisher, you can go on that website and click into Gift of Recovery and take a look at that.
Well, that was a nice thing for them to provide. I think that was a good idea. Another thing you talk about are cravings and triggers. And of course, this can be a really big downfall for anybody that's struggling with addiction. How do
Right.
you deal with that in the book?
Right. Cravings and triggers. You can't talk about addiction without talking about cravings and triggers, right? So, yeah, we recommend that people prepare for cravings. Cravings are 100% going to happen. And we recommend that you have a little setup to prepare yourself for a craving. So a craving is just that urge to use drugs or alcohol or to engage in a destructive behavior. It's natural, normal. It's part of recovery. So we recommend having a coping kit to prepare yourself for a craving, so that when a craving does arise, like it will, like you mentioned, a wave, a big strong wave, that's exactly what it feels like to folks. And a coping kit or a coping plan will be able to help anybody handle that craving when it does happen. So a coping kit really includes everything from having a plan of bringing something with you to work. If you have a craving at work, in other words, or looking at a picture of a vacation you want to take in the future, or having flowers near your office desk, something to really re-engage you with being in the present moment. And that's the piece.
And re-engaging you with your goal of what the benefits can be of not giving in to the craving.
Yes, and the idea of pause is to really slow down. It's the hardest thing for us to do these days with everything coming at us so much, so quickly,
Really?
is to slow down, listen to yourself, re-engage with your recovery, and provide that self-care for yourself as you move through the craving.
Yeah, I've got a note to myself here that you've got some affirmations uh, for coping with cravings. And so maybe I'll read
Okay.
one or two of them, and I will maximize the opportunity of reading with my glasses. So, and and I noticed that it didn't register fully, but yes, they're even named by Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, one for each of those. And so the one for Monday is cravings are a natural part of my recovery, and I move through them naturally. So that's a nice one. And then if we go through the week on Sunday, it's all cravings are temporary. So
Exactly.
again, so that's a wonderful thing there. And so much of therapy has been influenced a lot by CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, where a lot of attention is given to the things we tell ourselves, of false beliefs and things. So that really ties into all of that idea of countering it with different things that we're telling ourselves. So it makes sense to me. But I think one can also find roots for that approach in much older uh, self-development or therapeutic or wisdom traditions, if you will,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
mantras and so on that have a similar intent, I think, and a similar benefit.
Well
Uh,
said.
Speaking of well said, I like the phrase that you used. You said urge surfing. It's kind of self-explanatory, but say a little bit about urge surfing.
Sure. I didn't create this one. This is Dr. Alan Marlatt. I think he was University of Washington a number of
Yeah,
years ago, right?
I,
He
I
created this.
actually interviewed him some time back. Yeah,
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, he was a wonderful psychologist and leader in relapse prevention. So he developed this idea of surfing the urge or urge surfing in relation to preventing relapse of drugs or alcohol. And so his theory, and something that I use a lot even to this day, is similar to what we talked about a moment ago. The urge is like the wave. And when you surf the urge, you are on the wave and you're just easing yourself, like you're a surfer on the wave, easing yourself through and out of the wave rather than fighting the wave or going under the wave or thinking you can handle the wave. You're just going with the wave. It's almost like a Tai Chi move. And the person who can surf the urge will realize that you can get back to shore. It's really that simple.
yeah,
It's not simple when you're in the moment, but to realize that these skills can be there for you is quite.
right. The name Alan Marlatt, I believe he's also associated with what became the harm reduction movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I meant to ask you about 12-step programs because
Sure.
12-step programs are in some ways very absolutist uh, and contrasted with harm reduction, which has sort of a no blame and a an approach that says, well, you can set your own goal in terms of how much improvement you're looking for in your life and that you're willing to commit to. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's total abstinence, or maybe it's something that's short of that. So I'm wondering, do you align with either of those two extremes, I guess, in your own work?
Well,
Or is it both and?
yeah, well, I do have comments about both the 12-step and harm reduction. So harm reduction research has shown that it actually is useful if someone isn't in the dependence realm of addiction. You know what I mean? If you're using substances and you don't meet criteria for dependence, and then research shows that the harm reduction model works better to decrease your usage. But if you're, and you know who you are, if you're an addict or an alcoholic whose life has become unmanageable, and you've had social, behavioral, legal, work problems that are off the grid, and sometimes even what I've seen, homelessness and other things like that, then you really would do better with 12-step programs, and even in addition to the 12-step programs, groups and a sponsor and anything else to kind of give yourself maximum benefit to recover. So really, it's the pendulum swings from low usage, you can decrease with harm reduction, to use of drugs and alcohol that have completely messed up things in your life. And like you said, you want to have new goals. I like that idea. Then you'd want to, I believe, I think Julie and I are on the same page, my co-author, that you'd want to really, you want to focus in on 12-step and therapy too, of course.
So where does your book fit in with, on that continuum? I would see that your book would be very natural for the harm reduction people. Do you know if 12-step programs are using your book at all?
Yeah, our book just came out a couple of months ago, and our hope is that 12-step programs would use it. We're hoping that teen recovery centers will use it, and also across the country, intensive outpatient clinics would use it. Aftercare programs would use the book. It's almost like, here's a gift after you finish the treatment to continue with your day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month recovery, and to keep yourself in recovery. So yeah, I would say both, but I'm actually leaning a little bit more toward the folks that are into abstinence and wanting to stay clean and deal with the struggle of staying clean and sober.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, John, do you know how to pronounce his name? I've never known if it's John Kabat-Zinn or John Kabat-Zinn. Do you
I'm going to
know?
go with Kabat-Zinn.
You're going to go with which? Kabat-Zinn?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's well known for mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Yeah.
And do you find that stress reduction is important for those, particularly important for those recovering from addiction?
Great question. I think stress reduction plus emotion regulation are the cornerstones to long-term healthy recovery. So stress reduction, we have a chapter on progressive relaxation in the book. That's, top to bottom, being able to understand how to relax your body, which is done in a lot of medical centers, and you can even do it on your own by taking that chapter and just reading it through. So yes, stress reduction, physical, mental stress reduction, and then, as we talked about a minute ago, the idea of regulating your emotions so that when an event does come into your world, like a stressful event, like anything, it could be politics, it could be home life, you have a way to manage your emotions and not go down the rabbit hole of distress.
Yeah, earlier you were talking about the brain accounting for maybe 35% of, of the causal relationship of what's going on. And I've been interested by the language that people in neuroscience or neuropsychotherapy, if you will, are bringing into the therapeutic arena. And they talk about down-regulating, and which is kind of a brain idea it's so self-explanatory, it's hard to put other words around it. Yeah. To down-regulate, and that we have some control over that. It can be the result of a bit of becoming mindfully aware that, oh my goodness, I'm in an agitated state,
right? And
I can do something about that by slowing down, taking deep breaths. And so consciously down-regulating, self-soothing, however you want to think of it. So to me, that's an interesting development that's happening around all of this. Just having that conceptual handle of, okay, my brain is agitated and I can do something about that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned breathing, and that is the number one go-to to down regulate yourself or down throttle. So I do think even just now, as listening to you, I was just taking a nice inhale and an exhale, and it was helping me just refocus and be here now. And it helps my brain. So every time I feel a little bit anxious, if I just take a deep breath, that is the beginning of the entire journey to recovery and to healing. So the other piece of the puzzle is neuroplasticity. I'm sure your audience might have heard a little bit about this, the idea that the brain can bounce back from distress, and the brain naturally will bounce back from distress. And there's a lot of research going on, and neuropsychologists and neurologists are looking at neuroplasticity of the brain, the ability to bounce back.
Yeah. And you know what? I've got an Apple Watch here, and one of the cool features that it has is a reminding, a thing to remind you to breathe deeply every now and then. That'll pop up, and they have a beautiful graphic of an expanding kind of balloon-looking image as you inhale and fill up your lungs, and then kind of coaching you to slowly release that air. And I'm ashamed to admit that it pops up and I ignore it. Oh, I'm too busy to do that now. I'm too busy. I'm going to try to be better about that.
Well, let's make this permission to breathe. Really, what it's about. You know, a lot of the time we breathe all the way up here, and we don't actually breathe all the way down to the belly. And so sometimes just putting your hand on your belly and just taking an inhale and an exhale, this is another reminder to go to breath and to really, maybe 3 of those. Hey, we're not saying all day, just take 3 nice deep breaths. Sure. Will completely change the way your brain functions. So it's worth it.
And there's our yoga teacher talking.
Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of which, you also talk about the body and the importance of the body and making that part of the recovery process.
Yep.
Which I guess is what we're talking about here. Another issue that you deal with are values and self-worth. And so how does that come into the treatment?
I love this question because no one really kind of gets to this point, or they get to it too late. And I do think that talking about at the very beginning of recovery, talking about what you value, and in our book, we have about 80 different value words. You can get them online, you can Google them, but it's really, what do you really value? You know, for me, it's, I'm really into, I value longevity, and I value self-compassion, and I value service, and, you know, I value being calm. So those are my values. That's what I work around in my day, and I work around in the choices I make. Even being here with you, it really fits nicely with my values. So I'm going the way I need to go. People in recovery, they've lost track of their values. They don't even know what a value is. And so therapists would be very well served to just spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes with a list of values and seeing which one the clients would circle, and then maybe take the top 3 and then working on getting behaviors that match up with those values.
Yeah. It's interesting that you reflected on our being together right now, because I was having, just before you said that, I was feeling great about having this conversation because I was reflecting back on, I'm a little older than you are. So when I was in graduate school in the mid 60s, in the mid 60s, this was not a conversation that anybody was having. None of my teachers were having this kind of a conversation. And now it's wonderful that psychology is evolving and has evolved to let in so much of what those of us who were students in that time were realizing was missing and were reaching out for. And that's when I began to study yoga and some of these other things. And so it's so gratifying to have colleagues now who are kind of on the same page.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
And in yoga, they say in the beginning of taking a yoga class, they say, set your intention. And that's kind of what values are about. You're setting your intention, and then you're moving toward your intention. And I kind of think yoga and psychology are pretty linked up for me anyway. And it's really powerful to actually sit down and land on what values you're focusing on now.
Yeah, yeah. And I kind of gave a chuckle when I was reading the title of the book, or the subtitle again, 52 Mindful Ways to Live Joyfully Beyond Addiction, because the word joyfully is so unexpected.
Exactly.
When you're talking about addiction.
Yeah, I actually fought that word. The publisher brought that word to us, and I said, absolutely no way. It's not, there's no joy. That word just made me very nervous. And I really had to sit down with myself and figure out whether we would use the word joyfully in the title, because it's so different than how I was trained, like you said, back in graduate school. So upon reflection, I love the word now. Our first book, the Mindfulness Workbook, talks a lot about grief and depression and stress and anger. And this book is a nice talk about surfing the wave. This book moves us over to being more playful, more joyful, more present, not taking things so personally. So it really matches with where we were at when we were writing this book.
Yeah. Now I need to ask you, are you doing, in addition to the teaching that you do, are you working clinically with people and putting these ideas into one-on-one practice, one-to-one?
Yeah, I do have a practice in the evening and here in San Diego, and I am recommending folks start bringing gifts into their day in recovery. And I also work a lot with family members who have an addict or alcoholic in the family. And that's tough, right? So we actually are working to get the family members to recover also. So they can learn about addiction and recovery in the book, but they can also use the skills for themselves to stay well as their person in the family slowly begins to heal from addiction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. As a matter of fact, the interview prior to this one was with a psychologist or a therapist who works with bipolar. And he also was emphasizing that the family has suffered as a result, not just the patient, but the family too is impacted. And so works hard to bring the family into the process and do a lot of psychoeducation with them as well, which your book is also a form of psychoeducation, I would say. So what is your advice to other therapists and therapists in training who are going to be working with addiction and so on, other than buy my book?
Well, I love this question because I train a lot of young therapists, and I do feel that this one thing might be missing. Not just working with addiction, but working with trauma and anything else. The therapist's self-care is as important as the patient. And if I can convey anything to a therapist in training or a person who's been working with addiction for a while, it's that your self-renewal has to be paramount to working with people in recovery. It is not, you'll do it later, or you're going to go on vacation in 2020 and you'll deal with that in the future. It actually has to happen in the here and now in a mindful way. So I'm pretty, in this stage of my career, having done this for 20 years now, that's my main take-home message. Self-renewal, self-care, and personal recovery as you become a therapist for the long haul.
Well, that's a great message to put out there. What about, there may be some people watching this who themselves are struggling with one form of addiction or another. What would you want to say to them?
Yeah, I think earlier I was thinking about what is addiction, And some theory is that it's a coping problem. Some people say it's an attachment problem. We talked a little bit about being a brain problem, but I've come to realize it's a kindness problem. People who are addicted are not kind to themselves. And so I'm thinking that if I can say one thing to people in early recovery or recovery, it's about returning to kindness to yourself, being aware that you're not alone. There's many, many millions of people in the same place you are, either a little before or a little after, but return to kindness, give your brain a chance to rest with mindfulness and meditation, and you will get well. I mean, you will get well. So,
you know, that's a great message for us to close on. So, Dr. Rebecca Williams, I'm so grateful to have such a colleague and for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Dave. It's been fun.